It's the fall of 1944. The greatest war the world has ever known is entering its final bloody act. Across the English Channel, Nazi Germany is being pounded day and night by thousands of American heavy bombers. From bases scattered across East Anglia, young men who 6 months earlier were pumping gas in Tulsa, baling hay in Iowa, or shooting hoops in Brooklyn are now climbing into aluminum giants and flying straight into the jaws of hell. They are the United States 8th Air Force. The mighty 8th, and their weapon of choice is the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, one of the toughest, most beautiful machines ever built by human hands. 4 Wright Cyclone engines producing 1,200 horsepower each, a wingspan of 103 feet, 13.50 caliber machine guns bristling from nose, tail, belly, and waist, a bomb load that can turn a city block into rubble, and a reputation for bringing her crews home even when she's shot to pieces. Most days she does, some days she doesn't. But on November 23, 1944, one particular fortress did something no engineer at Boeing ever designed her to do. Something that still, 81 years later, has no rational explanation that satisfies every man who was there that day. The mission that morning was to the Luna Synthetical refinery at Merseburg, Germany, one of the most heavily defended targets in the entire Reich. The Germans knew oil was their lifeblood. They ringed Luna with more than 1,000 anti-aircraft guns and kept squadrons of Me-109s and FW-190s on 5-minute alert. American crews called it Flak Alley. Few who flew it ever forgot the name. Out of Bassingbourn, England, home of the 91st Bomb Group, 36 B-17s lifted off into a cold, gray dawn. One of them was a brand-new silver ship, B-17G 65BO, factory serial number 42316303. She had arrived in theater only weeks earlier, still smelling of fresh paint and factory grease. No nose art yet, no lucky lady or cartoon character painted on her flanks. The ground crews simply called her 603. Her pilot was First Lieutenant Harold Richard DeBolt, 25 years old, from Wichita, Kansas. Quiet, methodical, the kind of man who never raised his voice, but every man in the squadron would follow into hell without hesitation. His co-pilot was Second Lieutenant William M. Spaling, 22, from New Jersey, still baby-faced, still writing letters home to his high school sweetheart. Navigator, Second Lieutenant Robert F. Toner. Bombardier, Second Lieutenant George T. Abbott. Flight engineer and top turret gunner, Technical Sergeant James E. Heath, the old man of the crew at 28. Radio operator, Staff Sergeant Charles E. Chamberlain. Ball turret gunner, Sergeant Robert W. Bobby McGraw, 19, so small he could fold himself into that steel ball like a pocket knife. Left waist, Sergeant William C. Miller. Right waist, Sergeant John W. Smith. Tail gunner, Sergeant Anthony J. Russo, the kid from Brooklyn who never stopped talking about his mother's Sunday gravy. 10 American boys, 10 mothers praying back home. 10 futures hanging by a thread at 27,000 feet. They joined the stream, climbed through the overcast, and pointed their noses east. Over the Zuider Zee the flak started. Over the Ruhr it thickened. And over Merseburg it became a solid wall of black steel. At 11:42 local time, 603 took her first direct hit. An 88 Michelle exploded just off the left wing. Shrapnel punched through the fuselage like a shotgun blast. Engine number 2 began smoking heavily. A second burst ripped the bomb bay doors half off their hinges. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit. The intercom erupted in shouts. Number 2 is on fire. Hydraulics gone. We're losing altitude fast. Fighters at 6 o'clock high. DeBolt wrestled the yoke. The fortress lurched, fell behind the formation, and became a straggler, the most dangerous place a bomber could be. German fighters circled like sharks. Another burst of flak tore through the radio compartment. Oxygen bottles exploded. Ice formed on the inside of the windshield. The big ship began to shudder violently, the way a mortally wounded animal shudders before it falls. DeBolt knew they had minutes, maybe seconds. He turned to Spaling, locked eyes, and gave the order no bomber commander ever wants to give. Prepare to bail out. That's an order. Everybody out. Go, go, go. The escape hatch was yanked open. Freezing air roared through the fuselage at 200 miles an hour. One by one, 10 parachutes blossomed beneath the dying bomber. Heath, the flight engineer, was first. Then Chamberlain, Miller, Smith, McGraw, Russo, Abbott, Toner, Spalink, and finally DeBolt himself, who stayed at the controls until the last possible second to give his crew the best chance. All 10 landed safely in snow-covered fields near the tiny Belgian village of Petit Hallet. Farmers ran to them with blankets and hot coffee. German patrols were only miles away, but the Belgian resistance moved fast. Within days, every single crewman was hidden, fed, and eventually guided across France and over the Pyrenees to Spain, and from there back to England. Every single one lived to become husbands, fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers. Every single one carried the same story to their graves, but the airplane refused to die. With no one at the controls, with 2 engines damaged, with holes big enough to drive a jeep through, 42-31603 leveled off on her own. The sudden loss of 1,800 pounds of human weight caused her nose to rise. The autopilot, still engaged from the bomb run, corrected the trim. And something, call it physics, call it fate, call it the hand of God, took over. For the next 2 hours and 14 minutes she flew west, straight and true at 160 miles per hour, across occupied Belgium, across the frozen fields of Flanders, across the gray, churning waters of the English Channel. She never wavered. She never climbed or descended more than a few hundred feet. She flew as if an invisible crew still sat at the controls. On the ground near an Allied forward airfield at Glatten, close to the Belgian coast, men were finishing lunch when they heard the unmistakable deep roar of 4 Wright Cyclones coming in low through the mist. Mechanics dropped their sandwiches. A British anti-aircraft crew spun their guns toward the sky. Through the clouds emerged alone, flying smooth and steady, no radio call, no flares, no sign of life in the windows. She passed over the field once, circled, and came back. Men later swore she was looking for a place to land. She lined up with a long, flat, beat field just beyond the perimeter fence, the only open ground for miles. Gear up, flaps down, props in fine pitch. She came in low and slow, exactly like the book says. The belly kissed the frozen earth. She skidded nearly half a mile, throwing up a rooster tail of dirt and snow. The bent props screamed, then slowed. She slid to a stop upright, intact, silent. In the middle of a farmer's field, jeeps and trucks raced from the base. Intelligence officers, medics, MPs, cooks, anyone who could grab a ride, they expected carnage. They surrounded the bomber with rifles ready and shouted for survivors. A British major climbed the ladder and wrenched open the hatch, dead silence, cockpit empty, seats pushed forward, yoke unattended, throttles still set for cruise, autopilot light glowing green, navigator's table empty, charts fluttering. Radio room empty, headphones swinging. Bomb bay still holding 4 500-pounders that never dropped, waist guns cold, ball turret hanging open like a steel coffin. Tail gunner's gloves lying exactly where Tony Russo had dropped them. No blood, no bodies, no crew, just a 30-ton war machine sitting quietly in a Belgian beat field as if she had decided on her own to bring herself home. The news spread across the 8th Air Force faster than any official teletype. Battle-hardened sergeants who had pulled charred bodies from 100 wrecks stood there with tears running down their cheeks. A Catholic chaplain fell to his knees in the mud and prayed out loud. A grizzled crew chief walked around the plane touching her skin like she was alive. Someone whispered, "It's a miracle." Someone else said, "That's what American engineering can do." Most just stared, unable to speak. Investigators spent days crawling through her. They found the autopilot engaged, trim tabs perfectly set, fuel still in the tanks, no fire damage inside. The official report eventually read, "Continued flight after crew bailout attributed to autopilot and favorable trim settings." Engineers nodded and closed the file. But the men who saw her land have never accepted that explanation, because autopilots don't lower flaps for landing. Autopilots don't circle a field to line up with the wind. Autopilots don't fly 200 miles through contested airspace without drifting into a flak belt or a fighter sweep. And autopilots sure as hell do not execute a perfect belly landing soft enough that the same airplane flew combat missions again just weeks later. After a maintenance crew patched the holes, replaced 2 engines, and straightened the props, 42-31603 returned to the skis, this time wearing a new name painted in bold black letters beneath the cockpit window. Phantom Fortress. She completed 22 more combat missions before VE Day. She brought every crew home. And when the war ended, she was flown back to the United States and put on display so future generations could touch the skin of a legend. There were other ghost planes in World War II. A B-24 that landed itself at an airfield in Libya. A crippled RAF Lancaster that flew home across the North Sea with its entire crew dead. A Japanese Zero that landed itself on a carrier deck in the Pacific. But none carried the weight of mystery, the sheer impossibility of the Phantom Fortress. 81 years later, the old men who were there are almost all gone, but their sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons still tell the story. They tell it in American Legion halls from California to Maine. They tell it around kitchen tables on Veterans Day. They tell it with pride and with wonder and sometimes with tears. Because on one cold November afternoon in 1944, when the world was dark and freedom hung by a thread, a 30-ton silver bird with no one on board kept a promise that no human crew could keep. She flew herself across the channel. She found a field in a foreign land. She laid herself down gentle as a mother putting a child to sleep. And in doing so, she reminded every American who ever wore the uniform or loved someone who did, that sometimes, when all hope is lost and the sky itself is trying to kill you, something reaches down and brings our boys home. Call it God. Call it fate. Call it the unbreakable spirit of a nation that refuses to lose. But never, ever call it just an airplane. She was the Phantom Fortress. She flew herself home. And as long as there are Americans who remember what freedom cost, her story will never die. God bless the mighty 8th. God bless the crews who never came back. And God bless the silver ghost that brought 10 brothers home on wings of steel and mystery. This is her story. This is our story. And America will never forget.